Calder Wyatt found her hanging from a cottonwood tree, but it wasn't the rope that scared him, it was the sign. He'd been trailing a lost heifer for most of the day, the New Mexico sun beating down on him like a blacksmith's hammer. Out here, silence was the only language the land spoke, a quiet broken only by the creak of his saddle and the low moan of the wind. Calder liked it that way, simple, predictable. He was a man who had seen enough surprises to last a lifetime. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost nothing, a whimper, a little tear in the fabric of the silence. It was the sound of a breath that had forgotten how to breathe. He pulled his mare to a stop, his body going still, every sense on high alert. There it was again, sharper this time, like a thin wire being pulled to its breaking point. He slid from his saddle, tethering the reins to a skeletal branch of mesquite. With his rifle in hand, he moved like a ghost through the junipers and the sun-bleached boulders, his boots making no sound on the cracked earth. He followed the whimper until he reached a small clearing, and that's when his world tilted on its axis. She was hanging by her wrists from the thickest branch of the oldest cottonwood. Her body was limp, a broken doll suspended between the living world and the next. Her feet dangled just inches above the dust, swaying gently in the breeze. Her skin was the color of the earth, caked with dirt and dried blood, and her long black hair was a tangled mess. But she was alive. He could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Then his eyes snapped upward, to the crude wooden plank nailed to the tree just above her head. The words were scrawled in what looked like blood-red paint, jagged and furious. "White man, don't forgive." The air went thick and heavy in his lungs. It wasn't just a threat, it was a curse, a warning sign planted in the middle of his quiet, predictable life. His gaze darted around the clearing, scanning the rocky ridges, the deep shadows. Nothing, no movement, just the wind whispering secrets through the dead leaves. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife on his belt. "Christ," he muttered under his breath. "What in the hell happened to you?" As if she heard him, the girl stirred. A low groan escaped her lips. He saw the raw, angry burns where the rope had dug into her flesh, stripping the skin away. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. "You hear me, girl?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. No response. He moved closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He could see her face now. She was young, maybe 18. Her features were strong, with high cheekbones and a stubborn jaw, but her cheeks were hollowed out from thirst and pain. Dried blood was caked on her lip. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, his voice softer this time, more for himself than for her. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the rope. It was old, twisted mesquite fiber, coarse and brutal. Whoever had tied this knot hadn't just wanted her to hang, they had wanted her to suffer. That sign screamed at him, the words burning into his mind. He hesitated, a cold knot of doubt tightening in his stomach. This was trouble, the kind of trouble a man could die from. But then she groaned again, a sound of pure, bottomless misery, and it broke him. "To hell with all of them," he whispered, pulling his knife from its sheath. The blade flashed in the sunlight. "I ain't that man." With one clean, decisive slice, the rope snapped. Her body fell forward, and he lunged, catching her just before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp angles and bones, and she was burning up with fever. Her eyes fluttered open for a second. They were dark, vast, and filled with a terror so deep he felt it in his own soul. He eased her down, kneeling in the dust beside her. He uncorked his canteen, poured some water onto his bandana, and gently dabbed at her cracked, bleeding lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe. For now, anyway." Her eyes blinked once, twice. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, but her hand, frail and trembling, reached out and clutched the fabric of his sleeve. It was a desperate, silent plea. He looked from her face to the sign one last time, the angry red letters seeming to mock him. Then he stripped off his own worn coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. "Got a name?" he asked gently. Nothing. Just the shallow whisper of her breath. "All right then," he said, standing and lifting her into his arms. She felt like a bird with a broken wing. We'll figure that out later. For now, you're with me. As Calder Wyatt walked back into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, he wasn't just carrying a half-dead girl. He was carrying a secret heavy enough to get a man killed. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whoever left her there was going to come back to make sure the job was finished. He had just painted a target on his own back. The sun was a bloody smear on the horizon by the time Calder reached his ranch. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin, a sagging barn, and a lonely windmill that creaked a mournful song to the endless sky. It was a place on the edge of nowhere, a place where a man could forget the world or be forgotten by it. He carried her inside, her head lolling against his chest. Her breasts were shallow, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. He laid her down on his cot, the only piece of real furniture in the place, and gently unwrapped his coat from around her. Her eyes flickered open again, wide and dark, tracking his every move. He lit a lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the shadows, and poured some water from the well into a metal basin. He set it on the floor beside her, then grabbed a clean rag from a dusty shelf. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "Just cleaning you up a bit." He knelt beside the cot. Her legs were a canvas of bruises and scrapes. One of her ankles was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. And her wrists, the rope burns were like brands, marking her as someone's property, someone's victim. He dipped the cloth into the cool water, wrung it out, and hesitated. Then slowly, reverently, he took her right foot in his hand and placed it in the basin. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but she didn't pull away. He waited, holding his breath until the tension in her body eased just a fraction. He began to wash the layers of dirt and dried blood from her skin. His movements were gentle, precise, as if he were handling something priceless and fragile. The water in the basin slowly turned a murky red-brown. He worked in silence, feeling her gaze on him, a constant, questioning pressure. He didn't dare meet it. Her lips parted as if to form a word, but only a dry rasp escaped. "Reckon you don't talk much," he muttered, not unkindly. "That's all right. Silence is a better friend than most folks." He finished with one foot, then the other, wrapping them in strips of soft, clean cloth. He set her feet gently on a folded blanket at the end of the cot. "You remind me of a river I used to know," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. He wasn't even sure if he was talking to her or just to the ghosts in the room. It was dry most of the year, looked dead, but after a good rain, it ran so fast and deep you'd think it could wash the whole world clean. He looked at her face then, really looked at it, in the warm glow of the lantern. Her cheekbones were sharp as ridgelines, her lips cracked but full, her dark lashes thick with dust. She was so young, too young for this kind of cruelty. But behind the fear in her eyes, there was something else. Something ancient and unbreakable. Something that didn't flinch from pain, but simply waited for it to pass. "I'm going to call you Lena," he said softly. "It's a strong name. Quiet, but strong." She blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement. It wasn't a nod, not an agreement. It was just an acknowledgement, a single beat of understanding in the vast, silent desert. He stood and pulled a thick wool blanket over her, tucking it carefully around her shoulders. "There's beans on the stove if you get hungry," he said, his voice awkward. "It ain't much, but it's better than nothing." He grabbed his bedroll and headed for the door. He'd sleep in the barn. Give her space. It wasn't right. A woman alone with a stranger, especially not a stranger with a past as scarred as his own. Before he stepped out into the cold night air, he glanced back. She had turned onto her side, her eyes closed, her breathing already a little deeper. The basin of dirty water still sat by the cot, a testament to the violence that had been done to her. He picked it up and emptied it outside, watching the dark water soak into the thirsty ground, disappearing as if it had never been. But it had been. He knew it, and Lena knew it. And somewhere out there, under the same blanket of cold and different stars, the men who had put her on that tree knew it too. They weren't just going to forget. They were coming. And sleeping in the barn wasn't going to be enough to protect them. The days that followed were thick with a silence that was different from the usual quiet of the ranch. It was a living thing, charged with unspoken questions and a tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Lena, as he continued to call her, began to heal. The swelling in her ankle went down, and the color slowly returned to her cheeks. She ate what he cooked, small bird-like portions, and she moved around the small cabin with the cautious grace of a wild animal that had been caged for too long. She never spoke, not a single word, but he would catch her watching him, her dark eyes following him as he mended fences or tended to the livestock. It wasn't a look of fear anymore. It was something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. Assessment, curiosity. Calder gave her space, sleeping in the barn every night with his rifle by his side. He told himself it was for her comfort, but the truth was more complicated. He was afraid, not of her, but of what she represented. That sign, "White man don't forgive," it was a declaration of war, and by cutting her down, he had chosen a side. It was on the third morning that he saw it. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He was heading from the barn to the cabin when a shape in the dirt caught his eye. It was a boot print. It was smaller than his, the tread unfamiliar, and it was fresh, no more than a few hours old. He squatted down, his body going cold despite the morning warmth. He studied the heel. It was military issue, cavalry. The print was angled toward the barn, as if someone had stood in the darkness, watching, waiting. He rose slowly, his eyes sweeping the horizon. The landscape was empty, just sagebrush and rocks shimmering in the growing heat. But he knew they weren't alone. The feeling was a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He went inside. Lena was sitting by the small window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the empty land. She didn't look at him when he entered, but he saw her body tense, her shoulders straighten. "You see anyone last night?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer. She just pulled the blanket tighter, as if trying to disappear inside it. "I think we got company," he murmured, more to himself than to her. That evening, he didn't go to the barn. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, watching the shadows lengthen and swallow the land. The wind died down, and the world grew unnaturally still. The silence was no longer a comfort, it was a threat. Inside, he could hear Lena pacing, her bare feet whispering across the wooden floorboards, round and round in slow, restless circles. They were both waiting for the storm to break. It came the next day, not as a storm, but as a single rider. A cloud of dust on the horizon grew steadily larger, resolving itself into a man on a chestnut horse. He wore the blue and gold of the U.S. Cavalry. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but Calder could see the rough stubble on his jaw and the cold, hard set of his eyes. Calder stepped down from the porch, letting his hand rest casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. A man who makes the first move in the desert is usually the first one to die. The soldier reined his horse to a stop a few feet away. "You Calder Wyatt?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Depends who's asking." "Lieutenant Graham, Dust Devil Station." The soldier's eyes scanned the small ranch, taking in the cabin, the barn, the lonely windmill. They were dismissive, unimpressed eyes. "We're tracking a fugitive." Graham reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He leaned down and handed it to Calder. "You seen this one?" Calder's hand was steady as he took the notice, but his heart felt like a block of ice in his chest. He already knew what he would see. It was a crude sketch, but the artist had captured the sharp eyes, the high cheekbones, the long dark hair. Underneath the drawing were the words, "Wanted for murder, escaped Apache prisoner, dangerous. $50 reward? $50. That was the price on Lena's life. Calder looked up from the paper, his face a mask of indifference. "Can't say I have." "You sure?" Graham pressed, leaning forward in his saddle, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Small thing. Quiet. Might be hurt. We got reason to believe she was found by someone passing near the Cottonwood Flats." The Cottonwood Flats. That was less than a mile from where he'd found her. They knew. They knew almost everything. Calder held the wanted poster for a moment longer, then deliberately folded it and handed it back. Ain't seen nobody but jackrabbits and coyotes for a month. Lieutenant Graham's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a man who liked being told no. She's not just some runaway, Mr. Wyatt. She's a killer. Part of a violent band of savages that murdered a white woman and her child. A child. The original story hadn't mentioned a child. The stakes had just been raised. That sign they left by the flats, Graham continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. They meant it. They believed they're owed blood, and we aim to give them their own. Calder's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He kept his voice steady. If I see anything, I'll be sure to send word. The lieutenant stared at him, a long, silent battle of wills passing between them. Calder didn't flinch. He just stood his ground, a simple rancher on his own land. Finally, Graham gave a short, sharp nod. See that you do. He turned his horse and rode away, the dust from his departure hanging in the still air like a promise that he would be back. Calder watched until he was just a speck on the horizon. Then he turned and went back inside. Lena was standing just inside the doorway, her body rigid. She had heard every word. Her eyes were fixed on him, a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and something that looked dangerously like betrayal. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. They came looking for you, he said, his voice quiet. Showed me a paper. Said you were wanted for murder. She didn't move. She didn't speak. I told him I hadn't seen you, he said, turning away from her intense gaze and busying himself at the stove. Behind him, the silence stretched, thin and brittle. He could feel her wrestling with 1,000 questions, the most important one hanging unspoken between them. Why? I don't know what you did or didn't do, Lena, he said, his back still to her, and I ain't gonna ask. But out here, a man's got to make his own choices. I just made mine. He heard a small sound, a tiny hitching breath. It was the sound of a wall beginning to crumble. In that moment, a fragile, unspoken alliance was forged in the heart of the desert. He had lied for her. He had chosen her over the law, over the $50 reward, over his own safety. He had drawn a line in the dust, and now they were both on the same side of it. Whether it was the right side or the wrong side, only time would tell. But as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the land, Calder knew one thing for sure. Lieutenant Graham wasn't the kind of man to give up. The real storm was still coming. The day after the lieutenant's visit, the air on the ranch changed. The unspoken tension between Calder and Lena began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile kind of trust. It was a trust born not of words, but of a shared secret, a shared danger. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a space they occupied together. That afternoon, something shifted. Calder was on the porch, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes of steel on stone, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear her until she was already outside. It was the first time she had willingly stepped out of the cabin since he'd brought her there. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her bare feet seeming to test the ground with each step. The old wool blanket was still draped over her shoulders, a protective shield against a world that had tried to break her. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on a patch of bare, windswept earth near the sagging barn. Calder set his knife and sharpening stone aside, but he didn't move. He just watched, not wanting to break the spell. She looked smaller out here, more vulnerable under the vast empty sky. And yet, there was a new strength in her posture, a purpose in her stride. She wasn't running, she was reclaiming. She knelt in the dirt, letting the blanket fall back to her elbows. Her fingers, long and slender, closed around a small, sharp stick. And then she began to draw. Calder rose and walked toward her, his boots quiet on the packed earth. He stopped a few feet behind her, giving her space, his eyes fixed on the image taking shape in the dust. It was a bird. Its wings were stretched wide, caught in mid-flight. But it wasn't just a bird. Encircling its body was a ring of fire, the flames licking at his feathers. The lines were sharp, bold, etched with a desperate energy. The bird looked like it was both in agony and soaring in ecstasy, trying to escape the fire and embrace it at the same time. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a story, a prayer, a scream. He squatted down beside her, his voice low and respectful. "What is that?" Lena didn't look up. Her eyes remained locked on the drawing, as if seeing something far beyond the dusty lines. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of the wind. Then she spoke, her first words. "Bird in fire," she said. Her voice was dry and cracked, like a riverbed in the heat of summer, but it was clear. "It is the sign of my people." Calder waited, his gaze unwavering. He knew this was important. He knew she was giving him a piece of herself, a piece of the truth. She tapped the center of the drawing with the stick. "This was my father's sign, our family. We painted it on our lodges, carved it on our bows, always flying, always in the fire." He could feel the tension radiating from her small frame, the way her shoulders pulled back as if bracing for a blow. "Last spring," she began, her voice halting, each word a painful effort. "The soldiers came, the blue coats. They told us we had to move, to a dry place far south. No water, no game. They said we were a danger." The stick trembled in her hand. "My father said no. This was our land, given to us by the spirits. We would not leave. We would fight." Her voice thinned, becoming a raw, ragged whisper. "They did not wait for us to fight. They came in the night. They burned everything. They killed my mother as she prayed, my two brothers, the old ones. They burned them in their lodges." Calder's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. An old familiar anger stirred in his chest, hot and bitter. "I ran," she said, her voice barely audible now. "I hid, but they found me. They beat me. They tied me up. They said I stole a rifle, that I was the one who killed the white woman." She finally turned her head, and her eyes, burning with a righteous fury, locked with his. "I did not steal," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I did not kill anyone. I did nothing wrong." Her cry echoed in the still air, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and rage. It hung between them, raw and powerful. Calder didn't speak. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just looked into her eyes and saw the truth. "I believe you," he said, his voice low and certain. It was as if those three words were a key, unlocking something deep inside her. Her face crumpled. The stick fell from her fingers. Her shoulders began to shake, first in silent tremors, then in great, racking sobs. She curled forward, wrapping her arms around her knees, her long hair falling like a dark curtain, hiding her face from the world. The pain, held back for so long, came pouring out of her in a tidal wave of grief. Calder didn't move. He didn't touch her. He just stayed beside her, a silent witness to her sorrow. Then he reached out and pressed his hand, palm down, into the dirt next to the drawing of the flaming bird, his skin against the earth she had shaped with her story. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of solidarity, a silent oath. Slowly her sobs subsided. Her breathing evened out. She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears and dust. Her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, met his. There were no more walls between them. "You can call me Lena," she whispered. Calder gave a small, solemn nod. His voice was like the rasp of gravel and wind. "All right then, Lena. Lena it is." They sat there together as the sun bled across the western sky, the drawing of the bird in fire slowly fading as the shadows deepened. But the ashes of her story, like the truth, remained. He had saved a girl wanted for murder, but now he knew the truth. She wasn't a murderer. She was a survivor, and the real savages weren't the ones being hunted. They were the ones wearing blue coats and carrying flags, the ones who had stolen her name, her family, and her life. And Calder Wyatt had a terrible feeling they were coming back to steal the rest. That night the cabin felt different. The air was still thick with unspoken things, but now it was a shared history, a shared burden. Calder was tending a pot of beans over the small stove, the simple, earthy smell filling the room. Lena stood by the window, not hiding, but watching the desert settle into darkness. The silence between them was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence, a language of its own. She turned from the window, her movement sudden, decisive. "You want to know the whole truth?" Calder looked up, his spoon pausing mid-stir. He simply nodded, his eyes telling her to go on. She walked to the small table and sat across from him, the lantern light casting flickering shadows on her face. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but steady, as if she had finally found her footing on solid ground. "My father was not a great chief," she began. "Our band was small. We lived by the bend in the river. We traded with the settlers. Some of us even learned of their god. We wanted only to live in peace." Calder listened, his face unreadable, his attention absolute. "A full winter ago," she continued, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden table, "a white woman was found dead near our hunting grounds. She had been cut. Her husband, a rancher named Prescott, he said it was our people." Her hands tensed. "It was not. She died because he was a cruel man. He beat her. Everyone in the town knew it, but it was easier to blame us." Her eyes, dark and deep, found his. "The soldiers came, but they were not alone. Prescott was with them, and other ranchers, town men. They had rifles and they had hate in their eyes. They called it justice." She swallowed, the memory of physical pain in her throat. "They burned our camp. They shot my brothers as they slept. My mother, she died holding the prayer beads a priest had given her. And my father, they left him hanging from the council pole." The story spilled out of her, a torrent of grief held back for too long. He could see it all in his mind's eye. The fire, the smoke, the screams. "They called him a savage," she whispered, the word laced with a bitter irony. "They found me hiding in a hollow log," she said, her voice flat now, devoid of emotion. "I had my father's hunting knife, but they took it from me. They said I was planning revenge. They said I was the dangerous one." Her gaze was intense, burning. "They tied me. They questioned me. For days. Then, they took me to that tree, where you found me. They hung me up like bait." "Bait for who?" Calder asked, his voice a low growl. "For any of my people who might still be alive," she answered. "For anyone angry enough to come looking. They wanted to finish the job." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "Why did you cut me down, Calder? You saw the sign. You knew the risk." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. The cabin seemed to shrink, the world outside fading away until there was only the two of them and the heavy weight of the truth between them. "Because once," he said, his voice rough with an old buried pain, "I didn't." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "My family," he said, his own voice going flat. "Last spring, raiders hit our old ranch, south of here. They said it was Apache. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. It doesn't matter. I was out, checking the far fences. When I got back, there was only smoke and ashes." He stared into the flames of the stove, but he was seeing a different fire. "My sister, she was 16. I heard her, crying in the barn. But I was afraid. Just a boy. I didn't go in. I hid in the rocks and waited for help to come." His voice broke. "She died before anyone got there." The silence that followed was profound, a shared space of grief and regret. They were two sides of the same coin, two souls scarred by the same senseless violence. "You saved me," Lena whispered, the realization dawning in her eyes, "because you couldn't save her." He gave a slow, painful nod. She studied him, her gaze unwavering. "If my skin was white, Calder, would you still have cut that rope?" He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, her eyes searching his for the answer. He reached down, his calloused fingers gently cupping her chin. His touch was so careful, so measured, it made her breath catch in her throat. "I don't give a damn about the color of a person's skin," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I care about what's breathing underneath it." Her eyes welled with tears, but this time they didn't fall. She reached up and took his hand, pressing her cheek into his rough palm, closing her eyes. It was a gesture of complete and total surrender, of trust. And then, as if pulled by an invisible current, they leaned into each other. The kiss was quiet, hesitant at first. It was a question, not a demand. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, of dust and desperation. Then it deepened, becoming something else entirely. It was a release, an acknowledgement of the fragile, powerful thing that had grown between them in the silence. It was the feeling of two people who had been holding their breath for a very long time, finally, finally remembering how to exhale. Her hands came to rest on his chest, trembling slightly. His arms circled her back, pulling her close, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. The fire popped and crackled softly behind them, a lonely witness in the vast, dark desert. Later they stood by the window, their shadows merging into one on the far wall. Outside, the wind which had howled for days finally calmed to a whisper. The storm had passed, at least for now. Inside the small cabin, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, something broken was beginning to mend. Something scarred was beginning to heal. They were two ghosts, haunted by their pasts. But in that moment, they were alive. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt completely alone. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. For 3 days, a quiet domesticity settled over the ranch. Lena began to move with a new confidence, a sense of belonging. She helped Calder with the chores, her movements economical and sure. She mended his torn shirt with thread she'd unraveled from an old grain sack. He even heard her laugh once, a soft, musical sound, when one of the stubborn mules refused to move. But Calder felt it in his bones. The stillness was unnatural. The desert was holding its breath. He had seen smoke on the distant horizon, a thin gray finger pointing to the sky. Too steady for a campfire, too deliberate. Word was spreading. The reckoning came at noon on the 4th day. A trail of dust rose from the east, thicker this time. 3 riders. Calder was waiting on the porch, his rifle leaning against the wall, within easy reach. He recognized the men as they drew closer. Local ranchers, hard men with hard faces. Their leader was Joe Prescott, the man Lena had named, the man whose lies had led to the slaughter of her people. He wore a tin star pinned to his canvas coat, a self-appointed symbol of a self-righteous authority. "Wyatt!" Prescott called out as he swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with a sound like rattling snakes. The other 2 men remained mounted, their hands resting on their rifles. "Heard tell you might be harboring someone who don't belong out here." Calder kept his voice even, betraying none of the cold fury that was coiling in his gut. "You hear a lot of things out here, Joe. Doesn't make 'em true." Prescott spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "A girl, an Apache squaw, the one that killed my wife. There's a reward, $50 cash, and the gratitude of every decent man in this territory." "You rode all this way for a rumor?" Calder asked, his eyes like chips of flint. Prescott's eyes narrowed into slits. "We ain't here for rumors. We aim to check inside that cabin of yours, just to be sure." Calder slowly stepped down from the porch, placing himself between the men and the cabin door. "You got a warrant for that, Joe?" Prescott let out a short, ugly laugh. "This ain't a courtroom, Wyatt. This is the law of the land, our law." The air grew thick, brittle. The 2 men in their saddles shifted, their rifles suddenly looking heavier, more menacing. Calder knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he didn't move. "I'm the only one lives here," Calder said, his voice deadly calm. "There ain't no girl. Just me." Prescott stared at him, his piggish eyes trying to read the truth on Calder's face. For a long, tense moment, the world seemed to stop. Then Prescott gave a tight, angry nod. "All right, Wyatt, have it your way." He swung back up into his saddle. "But if we find out you're lying, you'll burn right along with her." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of dread behind them. The message was crystal clear. This wasn't over. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't bother with questions. That night, Calder built a small fire behind the barn. The stars were hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the air was heavy and still. He went to the spot where he'd buried it, and dug up the crude wooden sign from the cottonwood tree. "White man, don't forgive." He stared at the hateful words, the faded red paint looking black in the firelight. He thought about Joe Prescott and his tin star. He thought about Lieutenant Graham and his cold, merciless eyes. He thought about his own sister, dying alone in a burning barn. The world was full of men who didn't forgive, men who dealt in hate and blood. He stood and carried the sign to the fire. Without ceremony, without a word, he laid it on the kindling. He struck a match, the small flame sputtering to life, and touched it to the dry wood. The flames licked at the sign, hesitated, and then roared to life, swallowing the words in a rush of orange and gold. The wood cracked and curled, as if the hate itself was fighting against its own destruction. He heard a soft footstep behind him. It was Lena. She was wearing one of his old coats, the sleeves rolled up twice, the fabric dwarfing her small frame. She came to stand beside him, her eyes fixed on the fire. She didn't speak, but her presence was a comfort, a silent statement of solidarity. The fire danced in her eyes, reflecting both a deep, ancient mourning and a flicker of something new. Something like freedom. "Should have done that sooner," Calder said, his voice quiet. She didn't answer with words. She just moved a little closer, so that her shoulder was just barely touching his. He felt her shiver, and she gripped the front of the coat, her knuckles white. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. He looked down at her, at the top of her head, her dark hair glowing in the firelight. His heart felt heavy and full at the same time. The sign burned, the wood turning to ash, the hateful words dissolving into smoke and rising into the dark, starless sky. For the first time since he had cut her down from that tree, there was no sign left of what had been done to her. There was only the heat of the fire, the vastness of the desert, and the quiet, unbreakable bond between two broken people who had chosen to stand together against the darkness. The next morning the world was silent. The wind had died completely, and a thick, unnatural stillness had settled over the land. Calder woke before dawn, a cold knot of certainty in his stomach. They were out of time. He moved with a quiet urgency, packing jerky, biscuits, and 2 full canteens into his saddlebags. Lena was waiting for him by the fence line as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. She was wearing the same coat from the night before, her long hair braided neatly down her back. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a universe of questions. "We have to go," he said, his voice low as he cinched the final strap on his horse's pack. "Tonight." She nodded once. She already knew. There was no need for explanations. "There's land south of here," he continued, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon. "Across the border. They say some of the Apache still live free down in the Sierra Madres. Far from the soldiers, far from men like Prescott." He paused, then turned to face her. "It's a hard ride, but we can make it, if we leave now." She stepped closer to him, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He looked down at their joined hands, then back into her eyes. His voice was barely a whisper. "You'll come with me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pressed her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the soft whisper of her breath through the fabric of his shirt. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear, each word carefully chosen. "I want to live," she said. "I want to live as your wife." Calder closed his eyes, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. A wife, a life, a future. It was something he hadn't dared to even dream of. That one simple sentence carried more weight, more promise, than 1,000 flowery vows. He wrapped his arms around her, kissing the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to this earth. By sundown they were ready, 2 horses, saddled and packed with the bare essentials. Calder left the cabin door unlocked, swinging gently in the evening breeze. He didn't look back. There was nothing left for them there but ghosts. They rode south, using the cover of darkness, the moon a silver guide in the vast, velvet sky. Lena rode with a natural, easy grace, as if she had been born in a saddle. She didn't complain, didn't ask where they were going or what lay ahead. She just rode beside him, a silent, steady presence in the immense and lonely landscape. They were maybe 10 miles from the border, the land opening up into a rocky plain of scrub brush and shadowed cliffs, when Calder's gut tightened. Every instinct he had, honed by a life in the wild, screamed at him. Danger. Then the shot cracked through the night. The sound echoed across the plains, sharp and deadly. Calder felt a white-hot, searing pain explode in his side. The force of the impact threw him from the saddle, and he hit the hard, rocky ground with a sickening thud. Calder! Lena's scream tore through the darkness. She leaped from her horse, rushing to his side. He clutched his side, his hand coming away slick and warm with blood. Go! He rasped, his voice a ragged whisper. Keep going, Lena. Run! No! She cried, her voice fierce. Another shot whizzed past her head, striking the rock behind her with a loud crack, sending stone fragments flying. From a ridgeline not more than 100 yards away, two figures appeared, silhouetted against the moonlight. Riders, rifles raised, Prescott and the lieutenant. Calder groaned, trying to push himself up, his vision blurring at the edges. We have to move! Lena hooked her arm under his shoulder, trying to pull him to his feet. I will not leave you, she grunted, her small frame straining under his weight. With a surge of pure adrenaline and sheer willpower, they stumbled toward a dark cluster of boulders nearby, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. Calder's legs dragged behind him, each step a fresh wave of agony. His breath came in wet, ragged gasps. Somehow they reached a narrow crevice between two towering cliffs, a hidden pass almost invisible in the dark. Lena half dragged, half carried him inside, pressing him back against the cold stone wall, her own chest heaving with exertion. The sound of the gunshots faded behind them. The riders wouldn't follow them into the tight, treacherous rocks on horseback. Not at night. In the relative safety of the pass, Calder's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, his blood dripping onto the dusty ground, a dark stain spreading in the moonlight. He looked up at her, his face pale and twisted in pain, but his eyes were filled with a kind of awe. You said you wanted to be my wife, he managed to get out, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. She knelt in front of him, her hands coming up to cup his face, her thumbs gently stroking his stubbled cheeks. I meant it, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. His smile widened slightly, even as a wave of pain washed over him. Then we better make it through this pass. She nodded, her resolve hardening. And for the first time since he had met her, Lena prayed. Not to the white man's God, who had abandoned her people, but to the ancient spirits of the desert, the spirits of fire and wind, of rock and survival. Because out here, love was always a gamble, and tonight they were betting everything they had. The small tent, stitched together from hides and canvas, rustled in the cool river breeze. Moonlight filtered through the seams, painting silver stripes across the floor. Outside, the night was alive with the gentle song of crickets and the soothing whisper of water flowing over stones. Inside, Calder lay propped up on a bed of folded blankets. His breathing was slow and steady now, the fever finally broken. The ragged, angry hole in his side had been cleaned and stitched by Lena's sure hands, using a sharpened bone needle and thread pulled from her own tunic. She sat beside him, a basin of cool water at her side, gently wiping his brow with a damp cloth. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. You always this bossy with your patience? He murmured, his voice still weak but clear. She raised a single eyebrow, a hint of a smile touching her own lips. Only with the ones who are too stubborn to die. He let out a soft chuckle, which turned into a wince as the movement pulled at his stitches. She hushed him gently, placing her palm flat against his chest as if to hold him together. They had made it through the pass. Lena, using her knowledge of the land, had led them through the treacherous maze of rocks, losing their pursuers in the darkness. She had found this hidden cove, a small, secret paradise of green along a meandering river, just south of the border. For weeks she had hunted for them, foraged for herbs to fight his infection, and nursed him back from the brink of death with a fierce, unwavering devotion. The silence between them stretched, comfortable and full. Then as the wind sighed through the cottonwood trees outside, he spoke again, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "Tell me something true," he said, his eyes searching hers. "What's your real name? Not the one I gave you." Lena looked down at her hands, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. The name Lena was a shield, a name born of survival. To share her true name was to share her soul. She took a deep breath and then reached for his hand, guiding it to her own chest, placing it directly over her heart. "Ayana," she whispered, the name a soft melody on the quiet air. "It means peaceful river. My father gave it to me before I was born. He said he dreamed I would bring peace to our people." A sad smile touched her lips. Calder closed his eyes, letting the name settle over him like a prayer. Ayana. It suited her. The quiet strength, the deep, steady current that ran beneath her calm surface. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever. "Ayana," he repeated, the word tasting right on his tongue. He squeezed her hand. "You're the only peace I've ever known." This time she didn't cry. She didn't need to. She just held his hand tighter, the two of them safe for now. Two survivors hidden away in a small bend of a peaceful river, 1,000 miles from the world that had tried to tear them apart. Months passed, the seasons turning with the slow, unhurried rhythm of the river. On a small patch of fertile land, where the border was nothing more than an imaginary line in the dust, a small lodge now stood. It was built of pine logs and stretched hides, strong and humble, nestled among whispering reeds and wildflowers. In the shade of its small porch, Ayana sat cross-legged, humming a soft, ancient tune as she stitched a tiny white shirt. Her belly had grown round and full, a gentle curve visible beneath her woven sash. Her fingers, sure and calm, moved the needle through the soft cotton, each stitch a prayer for the future. Out in the small fenced-in pasture, Calder worked with a young Mustang, his voice low and patient, his movements firm but gentle. He had regained his strength, the wound in his side now just a puckered, silver scar, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Every few minutes he would glance back at the lodge, at the silhouette of his wife on the porch, and a slow, easy smile would spread across his face. Their home was simple. The walls bore no trophies, no portraits, just bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a few worn books Calder had carried in his saddlebags, and in a small hand-carved cradle in the corner, a child's blanket, waiting. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Ayana walked down to the river. The water moved slow and certain, just as it had for 1,000 years. She stepped into the shallows, the cool water swirling around her ankles, and placed both hands over her belly. "Little one," she whispered to the life growing inside her, the wind carrying her words away. "Your father, he is a good man. In a world that taught him not to forgive, he learned to love. He kept his promise." She heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the grass behind her. Calder came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. Their fingers entwined without a word. Together they stood and watched the river flow, the first stars beginning to blink into existence in the darkening sky. No one would ever write their story in a history book. They were just two hunted souls who had found a sliver of peace in a world full of scars. But here, in this quiet place, they had built a home. They had taken root. They had proven that even in the harshest desert, after the most brutal of storms, love could still find a way to bloom. And the river, true to its name, flowed on, peaceful and endless, carrying their story toward a new dawn. If you were moved by the story of Calder and Ayana, if you believe that courage is found in the quietest moments and love is the most powerful force in the universe, then you've found your tribe. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of grit, grace, and the untamed heart of the Wild West. Every story we tell is a journey into a past where survival was a daily battle, but hope was a flame that could never be extinguished. Join us and never miss a heartbeat from the frontier.